In light of where we're going to be today, the question I want to kick us off with is, when was the last time that you felt that pressure of comparison, or you felt the pressure of envy? Can you think of that? You know, because this is an experience that goes with you at every stage of life, right? When you're in elementary school, maybe it's like you're trying to get the attention of some girl or some boy, right? And you're not getting it, right? It could be you're trying to get the attention of a teacher and you're not getting it. It moves on into maybe a little bit older. Maybe it's a coach that you're trying to make the team and they won't give it to you, right? And then you start to look at what other people are getting. They're getting the attention of all those people, but you aren't. And you get a little bit older, right? And then you're chasing after maybe the affirmation, attention, acceptance of a boss, right? Because you want them to see your good work, your hard hours that you're putting in, and they don't notice. And they give a promotion to somebody else that's a slacker and doesn't know what they're doing, right? And then you begin to look at them. Well, look what they have, and look what I don't have, right? That comparison, that envy, right? It could be a lot of things. And then my question is, what happens to you as you go through those? So this morning, it doesn't really matter how old or young you are, it can affect you. Even all the way up to being a grandparent. I've seen grandparents so excited to see their grandkids. They kneel down when that little boy or girl is running up, and then that little boy or girl, instead of hugging them, does one of these, whoop, and goes to the other grandparent. You know what I'm saying? And I see the look on that grandparent's face, and it's like, why don't they love me, right? And it's like, so no matter what stage of life you're at, but the question is, what does it make you do? Do you regret, or do you resent the other grandparent, which might be your spouse, right? Do you resent and hate and become bitter because of the work environment? We're not making the team, or not getting the recognition of, that romantic other person. It's like, what does that look like? And when you feel insignificant and insecure, what kind of stuff do you begin to say? Do you begin to lie about yourself and to build yourself up? And or buy things that you don't need, can't afford, all that stuff. Because again, it's the comparison. It's the things that I don't have. That is what's happening today in Genesis 29 and 30. We see two women that are destroying themselves and creating a lot of issues that God thankfully is in the middle of, but they're doing a lot of things driven by what they don't have because they're struggling with comparison, they're struggling with envy, and that is shaping not only what they do, what they think, what they say, but it's shaping who they think they are in really deep and damaging ways. And so it's funny how it's so different for different people, what this looks like. But again, it's something that it can be at every stage of life, unless we begin to build habits in our life to fight it, to fight that comparison battle that we can get into sometimes. So what I love about this today is that we are going to see God working in less than ideal circumstances. We're going to see God doing two interesting things that he often does in the Bible. God will be there with you in your stupid, sinful mistakes. Thank God. However, God will also let you reap the very awful consequences of your stupid, sinful mistakes. Won't he? So you can't say, well, God just knows how I am, and then that's my free ticket to do whatever. Because if you do that, you're belligerently sinning, and God is going to let you have everything that you want, so to speak, even if you don't realize it's what you want. And so there's that dynamic today of God's going to be with you, but also he's going to allow you to feel the consequences and the weight of the choices that you're making. So that's another big thing that we see today. But these two women are they're caught between comparison and competition. When I say competition, they're competing for their husband's love. So backstory on this is you've got two women who have entered into a marriage with one man. And because of this, they're going to get caught up in this battle that's going to result in this principle here for this morning, that comparison is the thief of joy. Now, this is not mine. I don't own this saying. This has been around for a long time. But as I read through this and I finished all going through and reading through and studying, I was like, man, that for me, there's a million things that could pull out of this, but this is the one that rose to the surface for me, that this is what's happening to these two women. And it's destroying their hearts. It's twisting their hearts. And again, what they do, what they say, and even who they think that they are. Because comparison has completely stolen their joy at multiple points in this. So being married to two guys there's something that to get us there. So how did they get here? So you have Jacob, this guy who was madly in love with Rachel. He wanted to marry Rachel, but Laban, his uncle, deceives him, and so does Leah. So just to picture this. So you have Jacob, loves one daughter, Rachel, right? Laban, the dad of Leah and Rachel, he's like, no, you can't have my younger son, Rachel. You're going to marry Leah first, but I'm going to trick you to do it. I'm going to get you drunk probably, and I'm going to sneak her in on your wedding night, and you're going to get married to her first. And then you're working 7 years for her, you're going to have to work another 7 years for Rachel, the one that you do want. So this story has to be viewed in light of that treachery. Because here's the important part. Leah is basically constantly rejected by Jacob. Spoiler, she is never, ever, ever going to receive the affirmation, affection, and love from her husband Jacob that she wants. Probably in part because she went into his tent on his wedding night when he thought it was going to be Rachel and she slept with him. That makes relationships weird when you do things like that. So probably Jacob never got over that. God would make laws specifically against marrying two sisters because he was probably like, I figured you would get this, but since you didn't, I'm going to make a law. You can't marry two sisters because we're going to see today kind of the fruition of this deceit and this treachery and what this does to these two and how the comparison and this bitter struggle between these two sisters, this comparison fight is going to really destroy them. It's going to destroy their hearts. But that's where we are today. Now how this looked for Leah. Leah, like I said, she just wanted the affirmation and love of her husband. She's not going to get it. Rachel, her sister, she just wants kids, and she can't have them. She has the love of her husband. So they want what the other has, and they're just going to be caught in this vicious cycle that goes round and around and around and around and around. I want the love of my husband. I have it. I don't care. I want children. I have them. I don't care. And it's just going to go round and round and round. It's going to drive everything that they do because comparison, again, is a thief of joy. So, a little disclaimer, we're going to wade into some PG-13 territory today, all right? So, caught between comparison and competition, what's that look like? All right, so let's jump in to Genesis 29, verse 31. So, it says, in this one verse frames everything that we're about to read today. First, when the Lord saw, that's a big part of this. So, there's all this turmoil, all these bad decisions that have been made, and yet God sees what's going on. He steps into this story when, in a lot of ways, the people don't deserve it. So he saw that she was neglected, Hebrew saneh, I'll explain that in a second, and he opened her womb, but Rachel was unable to conceive. So that's a very strong word there, neglected, and depending on your translation, it could say it a lot of different ways. So saneh here, just to give you an example, and the reason I bring this out is because you understand the weight of these words. So that can be translated as hate, it could be translated as unloved, rejected, or even enemies. So this is a very heavy word, and this is the way that Jacob felt about Leah. Because again, when you sneak into somebody's marriage bed and deceive them on their marriage night, that's going to create some tension. And so this is the position that we start from. One, God sees this messiness, and he's going to decide to step into it anyway because he's fulfilling a promise in this family. But then also the consequences of the choices that Leah made and her father made. So another place this gets used is to show you, if you're familiar with maybe the Old Testament, the last book is Malachi. This is like 1,500 years after what the story we're reading today. And Malachi 1:2 says, I loved your ancestor Jacob, but I rejected his brother Esau. So the very people we're talking about today, this is how Malachi, 1,500 years later, looks back on this. Now, some of your translations, if you've been around a little while, you probably remember it this way. Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated, right? Because it's a very strong word. It's a very, very strong word of this total rejection. So that's the picture that we get of how Jacob felt about Leah. That's her reality. So I just wanted to slow down just for a sec, just to get you to understand how these people are feeling about themselves, how they're feeling about each other, and what it does as this story unfolds. So now we're about to meet 11 of the 12 sons of Jacob. Now, again, this is like, okay, are these just names? Like, what's the deal? Why do we need to know this stuff? Well, this is the beginning of the nation of Israel. People sometimes have wondered, like, well, who was the first Jewish person? That was Jacob's grandfather, Abraham, right? That's the first Jewish guy. His son Isaac is the son of the promise. That's the one that the line that God chose is going to go through. It's very important because he is going to father Jacob. And Jacob, if people are like, well, where did Jews start? Where did the nation of Israel start? Where did this happen? It's with Jacob and his 12 sons. That's where Israel began. The story that we're reading today is how they started. And of course, obviously, there's still a nation today. There's still a people today. So it still has implications today. And it has these 12 boys, 11 of which we'll meet today, have implications for the rest of the Old Testament, rest of the New Testament. So this is like the Genesis book is the book of beginnings, as we've said before, right? And so I just want us to be able to kind of grasp what's happening today. So it says in verse 32, Leah conceived, gave birth to a son, and named him Reuben. So a quick note on that for all 12 or all 11 of these, well, 12 too, Benjamin's later, but you have names that mean stuff. Like the names themselves, it's not like this name means that word. Usually what you have is this name means these words or this other word. It sounds like this other stuff because each boy is telling a part of this traumatic story that we're about to read. Each one of them is going to have to carry 1/12 of the trauma that their parents went through. And all the drama and all the hatred and all the envy and all this stuff, this bitter rivalry between these two women is going to be marked in all their sons. So in Hebrew, it's Reuven, and she said, the reason she named him Reuben is she says, the Lord has seen my affliction, or seen my misery, you can translate it as. Surely, and this is her hope, right? Surely my husband will love me now. So this is her desire. So the first child she has, this is what she names him, Reuben. And Reuben means, it sounds like the Hebrew word to see, raha. And Reuben literally means see a son. In Hebrew, when you have ben something, it usually means son of something or other. So she's naming her son for two reasons. One, God sees me and what I'm feeling right now. I'm neglected, I'm hated, I'm rejected, whatever you want to translate it as. But also, he's given me this son. So there's a sense of God's here. He's gifted me this son, but it's in light of how I feel because of Jacob, what envy comparison is doing. So verse 33, she moves on. She has a second son. So this is her second of 4 sons initially. So she conceived again, gave birth to a son and said, the Lord heard that I am neglected. There it is again, and has given me a son also. So she named him Simeon, or in Hebrew, Shimhon. So the second son about faith, but also about her neglect, because Shimhon sounds like the Hebrew phrase, the Lord heard, Shema Yahweh. So in Hebrew, the Lord heard is Shema Yahweh. So that's also out of Deuteronomy 6. It's the famous prayer, the Shema. And so this right here reflects two things. And here's what I want you to hear. Here's why this is cool about this story. So God shows up and sees her. She did something wretched to her sister and to her husband, Jacob, when she slid into that tent and lied to him. And yet God shows up, sees her, sees that she's hated as a negative consequence of what she did, most likely, and yet takes care of her. Yet he blesses her, and she recognizes that. She says that the Lord first heard me or saw me, and he heard me, just like Jacob's grandfather and grandmother. They did this to Hagar, and Hagar says the same thing. He saw me, he heard me. Right, there's a well named after him. Ishmael, Hagar's son, was named. And all in light of this, like God stepping into these terrible places and showing up for women that are rejected. It's really interesting theme early in Genesis, how God keeps doing that. Showing up for women that feel rejected and in reality are rejected. So there's this kind of sweet note in the background here on this as well. Then her third son, verse 34. She conceived again, gave birth to a son, and said, at last, my husband will become attached to me because I have borne 3 sons for him. Therefore, he was named Levi or Levi. So you can feel the pain, and as the years and the sons kind of start passing by, she still doesn't have the very thing that she wants. She's still caught up in envy, and clearly she's still missing the fact that she has these sons. The only reason she's doing them is to try to get that affection. And it's a great question to ask, like, what do I do when I'm trying to seek something that I can't get or seek something that I feel that I should have, maybe even rightly? And this is what it's doing for her. She's still caught up on it. And Levi, the reason she named him that is because that sounds like the Hebrew word for attached, lava. So again, these are all markers of where these kids are born in this bitter struggle and in this controversy between these two women. But then something happens with her fourth son. And this is a great marker. This is a great like watershed moment for her that doesn't last long, unfortunately, but I wonder, could you take this step? Could you see this? In verse 35. And she conceived again and gave birth to a son and said, this time I will praise the Lord. I will praise Yahweh. Therefore she named him Judah or Yehudah. Then Leah stopped having children. Now, we don't know why she stopped having children, if it was something medical, if it was something God did, like we don't really know. But at this point, she stops having kids. But she also realizes what has been happening to her, it seems. Because instead of connecting it to God seeing her and delivering her from this issue and like desiring to have her husband be attached to her who will never be attached to her, she finally stops and says, man, I got 4 boys. Like, what am I doing, right? Like, I'm naming these children in light of what I don't have, in light of my hurt and my misery. And then the last one, she says, no, like, I've been given this one because God is here. God is to be praised. So this name right there, Yehudah, that is her, I think, taking a step in the direction of realizing our principle for today, that comparison is a thief of joy. It's her being like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I got to do something different. And then like on that slide that was up there, Yehudah sounds like the Hebrew word for praise, yadah. And there's different ways you can say that, but that's where that name comes from. So it's like a step in the right direction, I feel. And I wonder, what do you do? Like she named one of her kids to help her take that shift. What do you do when you catch yourself? Like, man, I'm about to buy this. I'm about to say this. I'm about to do this purely out of envy and comparison. I'm about to think this about myself. My worth is about to take a hit because of what I don't have. Like, what do you do to stop yourself? Right? Like, what do you do to stop yourself from going down that road and being like, all right, step back. What has God given me? Man, God's given me 4 boys, right? So that's, you can see that happen in her heart. So Leah's 4 boys. The first one's Reuben, connected to God seeing. Simeon, he heard her. Levi, my husband will be attached to me, which doesn't ever happen. And then Judah, that pause, being like, okay, I'm just going to praise Yahweh God. So Rachel, though, what's been going on with Rachel as these years and these boys go by, and she's watching Leah, the rejected wife, the unloved wife, be chosen by God? Like, what happens to that? Because in this, we don't know yet at this point in the story, but I'm going to spoil it for you. Levi and Judah are 2 of the most important tribes of Israel. Like I said, there's 12 tribes of Israel. And here, this rejected woman that's not loved is going to have 2 of the most important sons in all of these sons, which I just love how God does that. He's like, I see you, I hear you, and look how I'm going to bless you. And she won't even know it, really. But Levi is going to be where the priesthood comes from. So when you think of like the Old Testament and like slaughtering animals, and there's like the Old Testament law and all this stuff, the people responsible for that are his descendants. Hugely important. And then Judah is hugely important because that's where kings are going to come from. Kings are going to come from that tribe. Not only that, that is the tribe of Jesus. That's his family tree. That's why all of this is happening. That's how this happens, is because God says, I got this plan, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Judah is eventually going to have David, who's eventually going to have Jesus and his family line. And so here's this rejected, hated, neglected woman that's going to have 2 of the most important tribes come from her. And not only that, but is going to have the Savior, Messiah, Jesus Christ. It's just amazing how he writes his story. God does, right? So that's Leah. Rachel, on the other hand, here's what Rachel's feeling. Here's what she's thinking. So when Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she did what? She envied her sister, man. She envied her sister. So when that happens to her, she basically begins to spiral. This is what it does to her. She says this, give me sons or I will die, she said to Jacob. She's going off on an emotional cliff here because of where she is in her life. There's a faith and fear dynamic at work here in this woman. And it's driving her to feel like she's got nothing. So here's the irony, is this loved and chosen wife, this beautiful woman, Rachel, feels like she is going to die if she doesn't have kids. Because again, comparison is the thief of joy. Because her culture says that's where her worth was having kids. She can't have any, she might as well be dead. Jacob responds in verse 2. He became angry with Rachel and said, am I in the place of God? He has withheld offspring from you. It's like Jacob's like, it's not me. And so this couple that loved each other so deeply, it's like none of that matters in this moment. because of what envy is doing to them. He's getting angry with her, she's feeling bitter, and he's like, well, this is God's fault, not mine. And so this is the dynamic at work in this relationship, in this very messy relationship. So then she says, this is how she responds, much like I said earlier, much like Jacob's grandmother and grandfather, they keep going down the same paths. She says, here is my maid Bilhah, or my slave Bilhah. This is how they're treating people. Go sleep with her, and she'll bear children for me, because legally you could do that in that time, so that through her, I too can build a family. So Rachel, to her husband that she loves so dearly, she gives another woman to sleep with, and he slept with her. Same mistake that Jacob's grandmother and grandfather made with their slave Hagar. And it's like them again saying, I don't want to wait for you, God. I'm going to do it on my own. If you won't, I will. Because of what I don't have, I'm just going to make this decision. And again, it's like, what does this envy drive us to do? What does it drive us to do? Because he takes her and sleeps with her. And my question as I read through this is like, where's Jacob? Where's Jacob being like, no, this really messed my family up, right? Like my uncle and my father, like, man, things are not good, right? Our families hate each other because of this very same decision. And he says nothing. And he goes right along with it and just sleeps with her. Another example of how you see something in the Bible that's culturally okay, but it's not okay with God. Like, you got to understand, like, this is not an okay, like, oh, man, yeah, why did God let... No. He wasn't, like, saying, yeah, go ahead and do this. This was, like, cultural saying, yeah, just take your slave, get her pregnant, and legally that's your child. They were doing a cultural thing, not a godly thing. So that happens, verse 4. And then verse 5, Bilhah does conceive and bear Jacob a son. Don't overlook what they're doing to Bilhah here, right? When I read that, my first thought was, how do we treat people? Like, how do you treat, for example, people that work in the service industry? Waiters, waitresses, people that work at retail stores, people that call up customer service people. How do you treat those people? Because when I talk to people in our church that work in customer service, they hate it because people are so mean to them and so ugly to them. In the South, do you know what day that waiters and waitresses hate to work on? Sunday. You know why? Because nobody tips on Sunday. All these churchgoers flooding out of these churches, and what do they leave them? Either nothing or a Bible tract. I want to leave them something that's of real value. No, you don't, you cheapskate jerk. You're just being cheap. Like, leave them the Bible tract and like a $50 tip, right? Like, be genuine and be generous. Like, do that. I've talked to people in Ohio, North Carolina, up here. It's like, we as Christians, I don't know why we think nobody's watching, but what we're like, how we treat wait staff, how we treat people that work in stores, and that's just in general. Like, when you, like, why does nobody want to work anymore? Probably because we're jerks in America, and we treat everybody like garbage. We treat people like they're treating Bilhah as if there's something for our own good, and that's it. They're a pawn in my story of happiness, right? That's a very easy thing to do. They were doing it then. Here we are 4,000 years later, and we can still very much do it. Side note, but still important, like, how do we treat people? How do we view people? What's their worth? If they're actually created in the image of God, do we treat them like that? Right? That should be a hallmark of Christians. People should be clamoring and fighting to work on Sundays. Like, man, they're always telling me about Jesus, which I don't know about, but man, they're generous. Man, they're kind. When I bring them the wrong food, they're like, it's cool, I'll eat it. Like, they're so generous, they're so merciful, they're so, all that stuff. That'd be cool if that was a marker. So today after church, go out and eat food and be awesome when you do it. All right? Be awesome. Verse 6, Rachel said, God has vindicated me. Yes, he has heard me and given me a son. So she named him Dan. And in Hebrew, that Dan sounds like the Hebrew word vindicated, judged, like God's got my back, essentially is what that means, din. So that's what comes out of that name. Then verse 7, Rachel's slave Bilhah conceived again. So here they are, right? She's just a pawn. Conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Rachel said, in my wrestlings with God, or in my mighty wrestlings, that Hebrew phrase is a little unclear, I have wrestled with my sister and won. And she named him Naphtali. So again, these two names are not so much about God's goodness, but about fighting and winning. Like, that's what Dan is like, I've been vindicated. He's judged in my favor. And then I fought with God maybe, and I fought with my sister and won. So these are all tied into Hebrew words and phrases that sound like Naphtali. But there's another thing here, though, that I think speaks to what's happening to Rachel. So that wrestling, mighty wrestlings, those words there, Niptali, which is wrestled in one, I've wrestled with my sister in one, can also be translated as twisted or crooked. Because I think what you're seeing happen in here to Rachel is that her heart is being twisted because of her envy, right? She's beginning to have this crooked path about life because she can't see the blessings in her life. Again, remember, she's the chosen wife. As weird as that is, she still is the chosen one that does actually have the love of her husband. And so this is what's happening to her, I believe. And I believe that she is falling victim to this comparison is the thief of joy principle. She can't see what she does have. All she can see is what she doesn't have. So again, happening again. So Bilhah, she's got 2 kids, Dan and Naphtali, right? God's vindicated me, and I've wrestled with God, I've wrestled with my sister. So when Leah, for her part, she stopped having children. Like I said, we don't know why, but she stopped having children. So she then took her slave, same thing, Zilpah, and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Like, how do you think this is going to be a good thing, ladies? Like, you're already tense enough. Leah, why would you do this? You've already got 4 children. You've got 4 boys. Why would you do this? Because that's what happens when we're envious. That's what happens when we're just comparing ourselves to other people and we're competing for affection, is we do things like this because, again, comparison is the thief of joy. So she does something terrible, culturally acceptable, but terrible to do to another person, and says, okay, now you're going to go off and sleep with my husband. And again, what is that going to do to your relationship? How is that going to endear you more when he's now sleeping with one other woman? So this is what's happening. It's such a messy family. So Leah's slave Zilpah then, she bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, what good fortune, and she named him Gad. So Gad does mean good fortune. Her next son, when Leah's slave Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, Leah said, I am happy that the women call me happy. So she named him Asher. And Asher means happy or blessed. And that's where we got the name for our daughter, Asher. Brittany went to a women's conference, actually, and Beth Moore was a speaker, and she was talking about this tribe, Asher, and how it means happy or blessed. And Brittany came home, was pregnant with Asher, and she was like, we should name our daughter, if we have one, Asher. And I was like, or not. Like, you know, it was like so out of left field. Like, you know, we had all these other names, and I was like, Asher. And I was like, isn't that a boy's name, right? Like, I just, like, it was so out of left field. And she was like, yeah, but think about what it means. And it didn't take long for me to get there once Brittany kind of explained what was going on behind it, because the Asher sounds like a couple of different words, happy or blessed. And so eventually I was like, yeah, and that's really been a marker of our daughter. Like, this really has been a part of who she is. And it's just kind of cool how God guided us to that name. But that's what Asher means. But now we're going to see some real damage. Now the fun begins for this family. So Reuben, verse 14, the oldest boy, remember, so he went out during the wheat harvest and he found some mandrakes in the field. When he brought them to his mother Leah, Rachel asked, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But Leah replied to her, isn't it enough that you've taken my husband? Now you also want to take my son's mandrakes? It's like there's no charity at all between these 2 women. And then the story gets weird. Well then, Rachel said, he can sleep with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. Now when I read this, I was like, so wait, what are mandrakes exactly? Like, and why is Rachel willing to prostitute her husband Jacob to get some of them? Because I didn't understand. Like, I figured they were some kind of fruit or maybe something yummy, but I'm like, but is it that yummy? Like, is it really that good? And so if you're a Harry Potter fan, you're probably thinking this, which is not, right? That's not the direction we're headed. What we're talking about is this here. So it is a fruit. It's about orange or apple-sized, and it's yellow, as you can see here, or reddish. Now, the reason what's important for us this morning, why there's such weird turn in the story, is because of 2 things. In that world, in the ancient Near East, the Arabs, they called them the devil's fruit. The Greeks, when they came along, would call them love apples because there was 2 things associated with this. One, that it was an aphrodisiac. So it would get you in the mood, so you know. And then it would help you with fertility. It would help you get pregnant. So this is something very much that both of these women desire. That Jacob's going to get in the mood, and Rachel specifically, that I'm going to be able to get pregnant. Rachel and Leah both have the same problem. Neither one of them get pregnant at this point. So they think very superstitiously that this is something worth fighting for and doing wretched, awful, terrible things for. This comes up in the Old Testament in another place. in a book called Song of Solomon. Now, this is a pretty spicy book, this Song of Solomon. This book is about two people, a man and a woman, and they're kind of dancing. They're engaged, they're betrothed, they're dancing toward their wedding night, and then the wedding night, and then like all this stuff. Like, so this big love story. And I don't believe it's attached to like how God feels about Israel. I believe it's a love story about the purity of the wedding bed, the joy of marriage, the joy of sex, all these things, written by a guy named Solomon, who I don't think really understood what he was writing about, because he had all these wives. But it's like the purity of the marriage bed. And in this, here's the woman's perspective. This is her love that she's writing back to her betrothed. And so this is the flowery language where we find mandrakes showing up. It says, "Come, my love, let's go to the field. Let's spend the night among the henna blossoms. Let's go early to the vineyards. Let's see if the vine has budded, if the blossom has opened, right? The time is right, if the pomegranates are in bloom, right? A lot of suggestive language here. There I will give you my caresses." And then what shows up? These mandrakes, giving off a fragrance. "And at our doors is every delicacy, both old and new. And I have treasured them up for you, my love." So in the ancient world, mandrakes held a pretty important role in that part of somebody's life. And so that's why they're fighting over them. It's why Rachel wants them. It's like why Leah won't give them up. It's why Rachel's willing to prostitute Jacob to get them. Sadly, ironically, neither one of them are going to get what they want. Leah's still not going to get the love and attention of Jacob. Rachel's not going to get any kids from this little deal. So superstition, not going to get him anywhere. But again, what's happening to him? Comparison is the thief of joy. It's making them do terrible things. Messy family. So when Jacob came, verse 16, when Jacob comes in from the field that evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come with me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." So Jacob went with her that night and slept with her. It's like he's just like some dumb animal. He's just like, okay. Like he's like a stud mule or something like that. And he's like, okay, and he just goes right in and he's like, oh, don't mind what this is doing to all these relationships and how this is destroying everything. And yet there's God in the middle of it all. Like these people are going to feel the weight of the consequences of the sinful choices that they're making, not doing it God's way. And yet God made a promise. And so he's going to keep working with these people, even though he's going to let them feel the weight of some of the things that they're doing. It's just like a wonderfully complex story about God still being there, about our choices, about God having this beautiful plan for Jesus Christ to show up through this very messy family. It's like, it's cool to know that God's got a messy family too, right? Like, I love that. Like, Jesus has a really messy lineage, and it involves these people right here that we're reading about. So, God listened to Leah, though, and she conceived and bore a fifth son. So, right in the messiness, there he is, 12 tribes being born. In verse 18, she says, "God has rewarded me for giving my slave to my husband." And she named him Issachar. Now, curious, what do you guys think? Do you think that God did reward her for giving up her slave to her husband? Is she right? Just because somebody states something as truth in the Bible, does that mean it's true because that's her perspective? No, she's wrong, right? These are people that are wayward. God is not blessing her because she did this to her slave. God is blessing her in spite of that. Right? I think this is a good example of God saying, no, I'm gonna fulfill my promises even in your messy choices. Like, again, that dynamic is just constantly at work in the background here, which I love. But this is her perspective. This is her cultural perspective. And so that's what she says. And she names her son Issachar, or in Hebrew, Yissachar, which sounds like Sakar, hired or rewarded. Now, I think about this for this poor guy. Like I said earlier, their names are a marker of the struggle that happened between moms and dad, right? Can you imagine being named Issachar, and you're going to carry the weight of the story of your mom haggling with another woman over mandrakes, and you becoming the fruit of that? It's like that's, again, the mark, the consequences, like the things that we do, the things that we say, and how he would carry this. Because like he's going to go on in his life and people are going to be like, oh, Issachar, is that a family name? He's like, yeah, kind of. Right? It's just like, how do you explain that? Like, well, actually, let me tell you a really awkward, embarrassing story about my family. Right? And so again, it's all their names are markers of where they were in this journey. So then Leah conceived again and bore a sixth and final son. "God has given me a good gift," Leah said. "This time," she's still holding on to this, "this time my husband will honor me because I have borne 6 sons for him." Right? This is the envy. This is the driving factor for her. So she named him Zebulun. And Zebulun sounds like two different words, honored or gift. Zabal is the bed. So that's where his name comes from. Again, telling a story. So later, it says Leah bore a daughter and named her Dinah. She's the only named daughter. That name is similar to Dan, which is, again, like he judged in my favor. She's going to play a really important role later in Genesis, like a really heartbreaking, sad role later in Genesis. So she'll be back too. So Leah has Issachar, carrying the weight of being hired, and Zebulun, the honored gift, and then Dinah. So verse 22, then God remembered Rachel, right? Like, what about Rachel this whole time? So he listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son, and she said, God has taken away my disgrace. So this is where it has devolved for her, right? Like, she believes that, this is part of who she is now, that disgrace and that shame. And I know, like, for myself, watching other people, like, when they get caught up in this envy and comparison game, not only does the joy get sucked away, but sometimes it gets replaced by shame. Sometimes it gets replaced by false identity, like, this is who I am. I'm a failure. I'm miserable. I'm stupid. I'll never be successful. I'll never whatever. And it's like that vacuum that gets created can suck some really ugly things in, as it has here, because culturally, she doesn't have any kids, and that makes her a disgrace. She's feeling the weight of what her culture puts on her. So again, like, what do we feel, right? What do we feel when we get caught up in envy, right? So she named him Joseph, and said, may the Lord add another son to me. Joseph, in Hebrew, Yosef, sounds like, has taken away, which is Asaph, and then add is Yosef. So this idea that, he's taken away disgrace, and he's added, hopefully in the future, one more son to me, which he does. That's Benjamin 5 chapters from now. But all of this, though, what all these women have been through, and even how they named their children, had to do with our principle today, that comparison is the thief of joy. Like, this drove everything that they did. Sometimes it drove them off emotional cliffs. Sometimes it made them take people and take advantage of people like they're slaves and do things that does not honor God, culturally acceptable. And so it's like, what's that look like on you? What's that feel like for you when that happens? So just as a quick recap, Leah, the kids, the boys, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Right, and again, Levi and Judah, from the rejected wife, from the unloved, hated wife, who was sleeping in the bed that she made, two tribes that are of incredible importance would come from her. Bilhah, Dan, and Naphtali. Zilpah, another slave, Gad and Asher. And then finally, Leah is going to have two more, Issachar, Zebulun, and then Rachel is going to have hers, Joseph, who is going to play a major role. He's going to take up a huge chunk of Genesis. His story takes up a huge chunk of Genesis, and he is going to have a lot of parallels. When we get to his story in Genesis, much later, we're going to look at the parallels between him and Christ. It's actually very, very interesting, the parallels between the two of them, but he plays a major role in Genesis, and he's really fun. I'm looking forward to getting into Joseph's story. But again, the everything, all those names are reflective of the comparison as a thief of joy principle, like in the struggle where they were and how they felt and what it did to them. And so I want to end by just asking you several questions. Some hopefully are convicting, and some hopefully will be good for your heart. The first one is, what does bitterness, envy, and comparison do to you? Whatever stage of life you're at right now, what does that do to you, or what has it done to you? Because people go through this, and then they feel like, well, I'm no longer at that stage of life, but it left a scar on them that still affects how they view themselves. Right? Maybe you're not struggling with like 5th grade Kyle who got rejected by Ashley Ramey. Right? Yeah. Right? And it's like, you remember those things though. And I remember fighting for attention and all these, it's like, but what does that do to you, right? Like, how does that kind of micro affect you as you get older? Because that was like a silly small thing, obviously, but there's people have major things that can really make them feel this way. I talked to a guy not long ago. He didn't have anything growing up. They were pretty poor. So what did he do with all his kids? He gave them everything. And then he said to me, and now my kids are spoiled rotten, and I don't know what to do. He's like, I feel like if I don't give them everything they want, they just hate me for it. And he was like, and I thought this all along I was giving them, right, because of what a comparison and envy did to him for so many years as a young guy. And his reaction to that was really unhealthy. So again, I don't know what it looks like. This spider webs in all kind of different ways for you, but what does that look like for you? And then some better questions, hopefully. Are you truly grateful for what God has given you? Do you actually pay attention? Or again, are you getting caught up in that comparison thing? Like, do you see, in spite of where you are, do you see, okay, these are the concrete gifts that God has given me? And I want to land on that. Similar to that, are you aware of God's protection? Even from your own mistakes. Can you say, man, but for God, I would be in trouble. I would be in trouble, except for God's goodness and grace. Right? Grace, give me what I don't deserve. Mercy, don't give me what I do deserve. Right? Like, without those two things, man, I'd be sunk. Right? Are you aware of those things? And then lastly, a way to fight comparison. Today, as you leave, put it in your Bible, put a note on your phone, talk to somebody, make a call, but make a gratitude list to fight against this comparison monster. It's going to help you remember how good God is. I did this about a year ago, and I did it for several months. And after the first week, it gets really hard. Because the first day is like, oh, I'm thankful for Jesus and my family and food. So you got to do 3 a day. The second day is like, okay, my car and my job. And then but when you get into the third week and then into the last month, it's like, man, I'm thankful that I stubbed my toe this morning, but it didn't hurt, right? Like you have to be really granular, right? If you do 3 things every single morning, and it's a really great exercise to say, man, look, there is a lot of goodness in my life. That dude pulled out in front of me, and I didn't hit him, and I wasn't even looking, and I just have, and so you start really thinking, about all the blessings in your life, and it'll help you fight that comparison dynamic in your life, that envy dynamic in your life, because 100%, not my saying, but absolutely true, comparison is a thief of joy, isn't it? I mean, we've all felt it, different stages of life. It looks different for all of us, but that is so true, and it's what wrecked these women's hearts, man. And I hate seeing it, I do. And I hate seeing it myself, and I don't want to see it in you, nor does God, right? But the beauty of all this, God's in the mix, and he's leading all this stuff to Jesus, and it's just a wonderfully powerful story of God's goodness in the midst of messiness. So let me pray on that. Lord, I thank you so much for your word. I thank you for being so good. I thank you for just the awareness that you give us about ourselves. I mean, here 4,000 years later, Lord, and it's like, we haven't changed a lot. We can still get sucked into the same stuff. So I just pray, Lord, right now, whatever it is, God, as we think about our gratitude list or maybe how we're comparing or being envious or what it's doing to us, what it's done to us, I just want you to speak to us, Lord. I want you to speak to us, Lord. Would you bring newness wherever there needs to be newness, Lord? Awareness wherever there needs to be awareness, Lord. And I'm asking that in your good and gracious name, Jesus Christ. And his church said, Amen. God bless you all.